Tickets available now at Ticketmaster.com. In the forecast, rain this morning with highs in the low 70s this afternoon. Tonight, mostly cloudy with lows in the mid-50s. Thursday, mostly cloudy again with a chance of showers in the afternoon and highs near 60 degrees. It's 63 right now in Charlotte.
This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. You know the drill. Our legislature draws new voter maps. Then someone sues, alleging the maps have been gerrymandered. Sometimes they win in a lower court. Sometimes that court's decision is appealed to a higher court. But the result is usually a ruling ordering the legislature to redraw those maps, this time in a way that doesn't disadvantage one particular group. We keep going through this. In fact, we're going through it right now because of the 2020 census. The legislature drew both legislative and congressional maps that were accused of weakening the power of Democrats and of lessening the voting power of African Americans. Lawsuits ensued, but a lower court decided the maps were okay. On appeal, the North Carolina Supreme Court disagreed and ordered the legislature to redraw the maps and show the court how they arrived at new voting districts. The deadline for accomplishing that was last Friday, and today, the lower court is scheduled to hand down their verdict on whether our legislature complied with the Supreme Court's order. All of this may end with that decision today, and candidate filing can finally begin for this year's elections. Or that court could decide the maps still aren't fairly drawn, in which case, they'll take map drawing into their own hands, further delaying the process. Either way, their decision will shape our politics in the next election and for years to come. So this hour, we look at how our politics may change after today with Dr. Michael Bitzer, professor of politics and history at Catawba College. Welcome back. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Steve Harrison is here. He's WFAE's political reporter. Steve, good morning to you.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
And for some special insight, we welcome Dr. Lee Drutman. He is senior fellow at the think tank New America and co-founder of Fix Our House, a new campaign for proportional representation in the United States, which we will be talking about. Lee Drutman, thank you for joining us as well.
Hey, thank you for bringing me into this conversation. Hopefully I can provide something special.
Well, I think you will, and we'll get to that in just a second. First, we're going to lay some groundwork with our two local guys. Michael, let's start with these new maps. If you were on the court and you looked at these maps and you had your chance to pass judgment, what would be your take on them? Did the legislature successfully comply with what the court ordered them to do, in your opinion?
Well, it depends on how you interpret the Supreme Court, the North Carolina Supreme Court's opinion and decision. Yes, these maps and the districts within are much more competitive than the map that they struck down as unconstitutional. At first glance, when they came out, I was quoted as saying they were shockingly competitive. We have more competitive districts at the congressional level, potentially at the state house and state senate, than we have seen in North Carolina for quite some time. So yes, I think the idea of trying to remove partisan gerrymandering out of the map drawing was successful by the legislature. The question is, and this is the big issue that I have, and I think others have with the state Supreme Court's opinion, is how much is too much? Where is the line to be drawn when it comes to tilting the districts to favor one party over the other, taking into consideration a whole host of factors? And that, to me, is still something that's very much unclear, and will be interesting to see how the trial court and potentially the special masters who were hired will deal with that issue.
This decision will come down, we believe, sometime today. It could come down as we speak in this hour. But Michael, which way would surprise you more, that the lower court will say yes to the maps as redrawn or no to the maps as redrawn? Which would be the bigger surprise to you?
Well, I think we have to also understand we've got three sets of potential maps, particularly at the congressional level. The two plaintiffs, the challengers to the original maps, have submitted theirs. The legislature submitted theirs. What I would, I think, be most surprised by is if the three-judge panel at the trial court threw all three out and drew their own. I think that that is probably outside the realistic realm, but anything is possible in this. I think there would be some deference given to the legislature because they are the branch of government charged with drawing the maps. So we'll just have to see what kind of dynamics the court really put an emphasis on and how much they're going to allow partisanship into this dynamic through a host of various tests.
And partisanship, Steve, seems to have played a role in these courts' decisions because the original 3-judge panel that judged these maps said they were okay the way they were originally drawn. And so the plaintiffs took the case to the North Carolina Supreme Court. The lower court has a Republican majority. The Supreme Court has a Democratic majority, and the Democratic majority Supreme Court said, nope, you got to redo these things. But it's going to be the lower court with the Republican majority that will decide whether they pass muster with the higher court's decision. This gets pretty confusing for average people. Why isn't the state Supreme Court passing judgment on these maps? Isn't this an extra step that's fraught with peril here?
I think that the state Supreme Court felt that because the lower court heard the case originally, I mean, they were the ones who heard 4 days and 50 hours of testimony on this, that they were best suited to review these maps and handle the case. I think it's important to note that lower court, which has 2 Republicans and 1 Democratic judge, they upheld the maps. They didn't necessarily say they were okay. I mean, they found that they were unfairly skewed toward Republicans. They just said that the state constitution does not prohibit that there's no guidelines as to saying what the map should look like. So I think that is a wrinkle that, we don't know how they will go. And Mike, you talked earlier about these special masters. So we have 3 judges who are going to make the ultimate decision. And then there are also 3 special masters who were going to help them review the maps. They are also judges or former judges. They don't have any particular, mathematicians or political scientists to review these. So we've got kind of like a nesting doll of judges and former judges reviewing these maps. A lot of people were confused as to what the second group brings to the equation.
Actually, I didn't know there were 2 groups. I know of the special masters that I think were appointed by the state Supreme Court, and they are Tom Ross, who is an affiliated Democrat, former president of the UNC university system, former state Supreme Court Justices Bob Edmonds, who is a Republican, and Bob Orr, who is now, he was a Republican, but because of Donald Trump has become unaffiliated. Who are the other special masters in that?
Well, those are the 3. So the trial court appointed those individuals and gave them permission to hire outside individuals to help them, give a report back to the 3 judges as to their interpretation of what the maps contain.
And I was just going to jump in. I mean, what Michael said about that the special masters hired outside help, that was another controversy this week in this never-ending soap opera. The assistants, the research assistants that the special masters had hired had reached out to the plaintiff's experts, the plaintiff's political scientists and mathematicians looking for clarity. There was a court order that said they weren't supposed to do that. There was supposed to be no contact. The attorney for the plaintiffs then contacted the attorneys for the Republicans, kind of saying, whoa, this was out of bounds. The attorneys for the legislature have asked that all of their work be thrown out and dismissed. That'll be another kind of, that drama kind of reminded me a little bit of, remember in the first hearing about the secret maps, that the House Republicans used, kind of in that same bucket of controversy. I don't know how significant it will be in the overall decision, though.
You're talking about the fact that these maps originally were supposed to be drawn in an open process that where people could get online and watch the process. And a Republican map drawer, in response to a Democrat questioning in the legislature, questioning them about the process, said no outside maps were used, when in fact he would leave the room periodically and check outside maps to see if they were working in Republicans' favor. And evidently that he had to admit to that in court in the later trial. Let's bring Lee Drutman into the conversation. He's a senior fellow at the New America think tank and co-founder of Fix Our House. This is all about gerrymandering, and this is something that you have studied and written about extensively. This state's original maps, as drawn by the legislature, either kept Republican districts safely Republican and diminished the power of Democrats in some traditional Democratic districts and made it very difficult for the political parties to be surprised by voter choices. But that is not just a North Carolina problem. This is happening everywhere. And you say that for, quote, 90% of Americans, the congressional district where they live is already in the bag, safely tied up for Democrats or Republicans. It hasn't always been this way, has it? And is it, if not, is it getting worse?
Well, it is definitely getting worse. Over the last 3 decades, we've gone from about 40% of districts being potentially two-party competitive to now probably about less than 10% of districts by the time this redistricting cycle is over. Now, some of that is gerrymandering, but the background change in American politics is that we've had this tremendous partisan sorting between the cities and the exurbs of rural America, urban America, and the cities and the sort of inner ring professional dense suburbs have become much more solidly Democratic, and the rural or exurban parts of the country have become much more solidly Republican. So it's just really hard to draw competitive districts without having districts that like snake from cities way out to the to the exurbs. I mean, the only competitive districts are those that kind of blend, kind of go from dense to sparsely populated suburbia. It's just a reality of Democrats and Republicans living in different places. Now, this has not only creates a very few naturally competitive districts, but it also really disadvantages Democrats because Democrats over-concentrate their votes in cities and just wind up wasting a lot of votes, having a very inefficient distribution of voters, whereas Republicans, by virtue of having voters more spread out, have a more efficient distribution of voters. So that's even before we get into gerrymandering.
And Michael, that's something that we've talked about on this program many times in the past when it comes to redistricting and voter distribution.
Yes, Lee's analogies at the national level play very nicely here in North Carolina. The fact that if you look at the statewide number of precincts, in 2020, 70% of them, so 7 out of 10 precincts, went for one party in a landslide, 60% or more. So when you already have a significant majority of the building blocks of these districts that heavily favor one party over the other, you can't necessarily create large swaths of competitive districts because the unique political geography of North Carolina doesn't necessarily allow it to happen. The most competitive areas are going to be in the urban suburbs, the Huntersvilles, the Davidsons, the Mint Hills, the Pinevilles, outside of the central city of Charlotte, for example, but inside Mecklenburg County. So this dynamic plays a major role in terms of where the lines get placed and who helps.
These areas that you just spoke about are the areas that the Lee Drutman says are where the lines begin to blur, where dark blue and dark red begin to become purple. And there's a chance in those areas for races to be competitive. There's a solution to this, according to Lee Drutman, and we'll talk about it. It's called proportional representation. We'll get into that in a moment when we come back. Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Tyndall Subaru Gastonia, featuring the new 2022 Subaru Ascent with performance, technology, and design updates throughout. Details at tyndallsubaru.com and on Facebook at Tyndall Subaru. And Stetson University's School of Music Concert Choir, a 56-voice touring choir led by Dr. Timothy Peter, Friday, February 25th at 7:30 p.m. at Lenore Ryan University Chapel. No ticket required. Coming up tomorrow on this program, understanding the soul of America through the South. Elsewhere in the country, the South's identity is reduced to dated stereotypes, forever entangled in our racist history. But author Imani Perry believes the story of the South is more complex, and the region has become a repository for the nation's sins. A Southerner in exile, she returns to her roots in her new book, South to America, and says misunderstanding the South mischaracterizes the nation. She'll talk about that tomorrow at 9.
President Joe Biden will deliver his first State of the Union address on March 1st. The speech to Congress comes as the White House works to battle soaring inflation, curb COVID-19 infections, and nominate a new Supreme Court justice. Join us Tuesday for live coverage of the 2022 State of the Union and expert analysis from NPR News.
That's Tuesday night starting at 9 o'clock here at 90.7 WFAE and WFAE.org.
It's Charlotte Talks on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins as we await the lower court three-judge panel's decision on whether or not the newly redrawn congressional and legislative maps in North Carolina pass muster with the state Supreme Court's order. We are talking about that and more with Dr. Michael Bitzer, who's a professor of politics and history at Catawba College, Steve Harrison, WFAE's political reporter, and Dr. Lee Drutman, a senior fellow at the New America think tank. The problem, it turns out, is gerrymandering, but then again, maybe it's not gerrymandering because of political geography in which where Republicans live and where Democrats tend to congregate seem to lock people into drawing districts in a particular way. And we certainly have seen that in operation here in North Carolina. But Lee Drutman, you say there is a prescription for this, and it is called proportional representation. What is that, and how would it work?
Proportional representation is a system that is used around the world. Most countries have larger districts. The use of the single member district that we use in the US and North Carolina is really an anomaly. Most democracies have larger districts in which the seats that parties get in the legislature are allocated proportionally to their share of the vote. So the most, you could think of, rather than North Carolina being split up into 14 single member districts, what if the state was split in half? There was one 7-member district in the West and one 7-member district in the East. And then if Democrats and Republicans, or maybe even more parties, can run candidates, and then they get votes, if that translate directly into seats. So, if Democrats get 50% of the votes statewide, they should just get 50% of the seats. Republicans get 50%, they should just get 50% of the seats. It's pretty simple. It's pretty intuitive. Proportional representation, it refers to a broader family of voting systems. There's all kinds of ways that you can do it, but the basic principle is really simple. It's that the share of votes that you get should translate into the share of seats that you get. Rather than this cockamamie, weird thing where we draw these districts and then we have to have judges and special masters and go back and forth. It's a very strange way to do things.
So let me see if I understand. Let me see if I understand this. You're talking about taking any state, not just North Carolina, and dividing it in half. I don't know, does it matter how you divide it in half? Would it be equally fair if you drew the line north-south, east-west on a diagonal? Does it matter whether it's evenly divided geographically speaking? And what you're saying that when you divide it is that each half gets half of the representatives that are allotted to that state. That's what you're saying, right? And does it matter where you draw the line?
Not really. Now, you could also have North Carolina be one statewide district, 14 members. I think a 7-member district is probably, I think 5 to 7 members is probably the ideal size for a proportional district, because what happens when you get larger districts with 14 members or more, as a function of district size, you allow more parties in, and more parties are good, but at a certain level. So at a 7-member district, you'd need about 14% of the vote to have representation. Now, in a 14-member district, you need a lower threshold. I mean, you could, an extreme example is the Netherlands, which has one nationwide district with 150 seats for its legislature, and they have like 13 parties in their legislature. They also have a very low threshold. There's a lot of ways you can think about this, but you know, the basic way to think about it is that the larger the district size, the easier it is to achieve proportionality.
So all of these people would be elected at large. They would not represent Mecklenburg County per se. They would be elected at large. How would that change how they vote and the complexion of our politics, either at the state or level or in Congress?
Well, what it means is that now you can think of, well, since you're in Western North Carolina, let's think of Western North Carolina, and you know, we could envision, you know, some more progressive Democrats maybe representing Charlotte, you know, more moderate Democrats, more centrist Republicans, and you know, more extreme far right Republicans, and you know, maybe some additional parties. Right. Part of the challenge of our current representation structure is that the only places that send Democrats to Congress are much more liberal than the country at large, and the only places that send Republicans to Congress are much more conservative than the country at large. So you wind up with some conservative Democrats who just basically have no representation in the far western part of the state. You wind up with some more liberal Republicans around the cities who have no representation in Congress. And so what you wind up with is a broader diverse array of representatives, which is frankly what we used to have in this country. We used to have liberal Republicans, we used to have conservative Democrats, and that allowed for bipartisanship and cross-partisan compromise to flourish. It also means that your vote matters wherever you live. You know, you don't have to live in a swing district for your vote to matter. Means that the parties and the candidates are going to be reaching out to voters across the state, and it just is a much fairer system of representation that makes gerrymandering useless, pointless, irrelevant.
So, Michael Bitzer, in order for this to happen, what would it take? Would it take a state law? Would it take a constitutional amendment at the state level or the national level? And given our politics, is that ever likely to happen?
Well, certainly Lee can talk, I think, more broadly the concepts. I believe that there is a U.S. law that says that members of Congress, members from this House, have to come from single member districts. So that would require a change in federal law. It would also kind of give up the power of particularly incumbents to claim a specific region or a specific area where they build their base of political support. It would require candidates to be much more expansive in terms of how they approach the dynamics here. And it would also kind of create, you know, we're doing away with the winner take all system that we currently utilize and replace it with this proportionality. What's the threshold? How many seats, you know, would be then determined by it?
I was going to say,
Go ahead, Steve.
Oh, I was just going to jump in and say that the map that's being decided this morning, the most recent iteration, favors Republicans in 6 seats, Democrats in 4, and 4 toss-ups. You know, that map starts to get closer to this idea of having swing districts and having competitive districts and having candidates elected from the middle. I mean, those 4 districts are truly split down the middle. And I think if the map is enacted, then you know, you can have candidates who have to appeal in those 4 districts, at least, to both sides. And that will be a change in North Carolina that is not true under the current map. And so that would be a big difference.
And whether or not there had been a lawsuit that resulted in what we're going through today and the decision that we are anticipating sometime today, things would have changed in North Carolina because of the population growth has given us an additional district, at least congressionally, the 14th Congressional District, part of which runs through Mecklenburg County. How does what the legislature proposed for that district, its area, and where the dividing lines are drawn, compare to the maps that they have resubmitted? How would the 14th district look different if those maps are approved, Steve?
So in the original map from last year, the 2021 map, Republicans cleverly, I think is a good way to put it, kept the city of Charlotte mostly intact. And by doing that, in a way, that sounds good, right? Well, we don't want to split cities, but that kind of corrals lots of Democrats together into one place and waste a lot of Democratic votes. And then they took the rest of the county and put it into 2 other districts and kind of diluted the rest of the Democrats. This map is much more favorable for Democrats because it only divides Mecklenburg County once, and it does it, almost cuts the city of Charlotte in half. And in a way, that sounds terrible, right? Like, why would we want to split the city in half? But by doing that, you have a safe seat for Democrats that Alma Adams will win. And then there are tons of Democratic voters in West Charlotte and Southwest Charlotte that are going to be paired with Gaston County and Cleveland County. And when you have that pairing, it makes for that toss-up seat. So now the Democrats have a chance to win 2 seats out of Mecklenburg County. And in the old map, they were going to win 1 and had 0 chance essentially of winning a second.
And that brings up the topic of Madison Cawthorn, who has represented Western North Carolina in the last several years. He's the most conservative member of Congress, perhaps. I think that's safe to say. And he was deciding about whether or not to run in his original district for re-election this time around or move to the 14th. And if he moves to the 14th, that is the reason that North Carolina State House Speaker Tim Moore decided not to throw his hat into the ring. But with this redraw, if it is accepted by the court, Madison Cawthorn may decide to stay in his original district. Would that then open the door for Tim Moore? And do you think Tim Moore would decide, okay, well, I'm going to run for Congress?
Yeah, I think a lot of, so many people when filing opens are going to be watching Madison Cawthorn so closely as to what he does. And that includes a lot of Democrats, because if Cawthorn runs in that 14th district, the Mecklenburg, Gaston, Cleveland, I think you'd have a lot of Democrats in Charlotte who would say, wait, I can beat that guy. And there's going to be some that are going to say, I can't beat Tim Moore in 2022 in a good year for Republicans. But Madison Cawthorn is so polarizing that, hey, this is the one Republican that we could knock off. So I think a lot of people now think that Cawthorn, like you said, Mike, is going to go back to the mountains. That he is so polarizing, it's going to be hard for him to win a 50-50 seat. I think that he's the one candidate that could really get Democrats motivated and excited this year. He just has that unique ability. He will drive turnout.
Michael, we spent a lot of time talking about the congressional maps, not a lot of time talking about the legislative maps, but nonetheless, what are your impressions of how the complexion of North Carolina will turn out politically if these 2 maps are accepted the way they are drawn by the lower court today?
I think certainly both chambers of the legislature would be, as the congressional map indicates, much more competitive. But I think you also have to take into account the electoral environment that we're going to be confronting come November of 2022. It's a midterm election. Generally, midterm elections are not productive for the president's party, so Democrats are going to be facing some real headwinds. There are more competitive seats in both the state house and state senate as compared to the previous maps that were struck down. But I think Republicans are going to come in with a natural advantage. They generally do in terms of midterms. Registered Republicans have higher turnout levels than registered Democrats in midterm elections in this state. So there's going to be an automatic advantage to the Republicans. The question is, how big of a majority could potentially Republicans build in both chambers? Under the previous maps, it was very easy to see them get to supermajority status. Supermajority means that they could override a governor's veto and basically have carte blanche over the lawmaking process. In this environment, I don't necessarily see it unless it is a huge Republican wave kind of year. We'll just have to wait and see how the dynamics play out between now and November.
Lee Drutman, you've been watching these various attempts at gerrymandering take place around the country, and at attempts to rectify gerrymandering unfolding all over the country. And we've been watching as Republican-controlled legislatures draw maps in ways that result in what many people say is a gross overrepresentation of Republicans in Congress and at the state level. And this state is certainly a good example. We apparently split down the middle. We're kind of a purple state, and we're almost 50-50 split when it comes to presidential elections, at least in the last several elections. What is the impact of these shenanigans, which are certainly not invisible to the public at large, on our politics and on voters' faith in the fairness of the system?
Well, I think you've hit on a very important point here, Mike, which is that when these districts go through all these shenanigans, which is a good word for it, it just for most voters, it feels like, well, like where do I matter in this? It's the old line about politicians choosing their voters as opposed to voters choosing their politicians. And it also means, again, that a lot of voters are going to be in districts where their votes don't matter because it's so lopsided for one party or the other, where the primary election is going to be the main election, which tends to pull parties even more to the extremes. And that's just bad for democracy. If most voters feel like their votes don't matter, because they really don't. If parties and candidates really aren't trying to reach out to voters because they don't actually need their votes to win, that's bad for democracy. And if the support that parties get, or the number of seats that parties get in the legislature, is really disconnected from the support they receive statewide, that is also tremendously bad for democracy. It creates a sense of illegitimacy. I mean, the single member district system that we use in this country is a system in which where voters live is the most, and how voters are distributed is more important than how popular parties are and whether individual votes even matter. I mean, it's a crazy system when you think about it. It's just an accident of history that we still have this system. And yes, we need to change a federal law to allow states to use proportional districts for Congress, but states could do it for their own legislature. There's nothing preventing states from doing that, although it may depend on some states may have constitutional restrictions on that, but state constitutions are far easier to change than federal constitutions.
And we should point out that Democrats do this and have done it, and they've done it in this state over time in terms of drawing districts to benefit their party over the Republicans. But it seems that Republicans are doing it more egregiously now, and perhaps that is because over a long period of time, looking at the long-range plan, they have put people in place that make it more and more advantageous to be a Republican office holder than a Democratic office holder. Redistricting commissions, Michael, have been put in place in some parts of the country to draw maps that are less partisan. Have they worked?
I think that this cycle is going to be the real test of that. If you look at a place like Virginia, and I'm not an expert, Lee would probably has a better sense of the national dynamics. But if you think about Virginia and what they're attempting to do, Ohio is attempting to redraw their districts. It's breaking down based on partisanship. It's a fight between the redistricting commission and I believe their state Supreme Court. Virginia's commission, I think, also broke down. So there are some real dynamics that have to be looked at past this cycle.
When we come back, we'll talk about the impact, the possible addition of another party in all of this and how likely that would be to help. It's Charlotte Talks. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Airy Consulting, delivering Microsoft Teams, Dynamics 365, and Power Apps platform solutions designed to accelerate employee productivity. More information at aerieconsulting.com. And Greenbrook TMS NeuroHealth, specializing in depression that hasn't responded to medications and therapy. The goal is to help achieve remission from depression. Depression specialists can be found at greenbrook.tms.com. Coming up in 20 minutes, ahead of a possible large-scale Russian invasion, Ukraine's government has approved plans to declare a 30-day state of emergency. It's also called up military reservists and begun to draft legislation that will allow ordinary civilians to carry firearms. That's the topic of the conversation in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock on 1A, and we'll continue our talk about redistricting in 30 seconds. Stay with us.
WFAE invites you to a special live event Tuesday, March 8th. Charlotte Mayor Vi Lyles and others will join Charlotte Talks host Mike Collins for Equilibrium, a candid conversation about race and equity. And on February 28th, we'll hope you'll join us for a special virtual announcement about our race and equity team. Details and registration for both events at WFAE.org. Major support for WFAE's race and equity team comes from Wells Fargo.
It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about voting, redistricting, gerrymandering, and in anticipation of the decision coming down sometime today from a North Carolina 3-judge panel about whether the maps that were ordered to be redrawn by the North Carolina Supreme Court will be adopted for this coming election. Dr. Michael Bitzer is here, professor of politics at Catawba College. Dr. Lee Drutman, senior fellow at the New America think tank and co-founder of Fix Our House, and Steve Harrison, WFAE's political reporter. Before we move on, I know that Dr. Bitzer, you want to talk a little bit more about partisanship and redistricting. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what I was saying before the break. You know, we as scholars have to understand, as Chuck Bullock, who has written the book on redistricting, has said, it is the most political activity in American politics. And what has happened over time is that the voters have sorted themselves much more into the political parties. As Lee noted earlier, conservative Southern Democrats, Northeastern liberal Republicans, they're basically extinct. And so what we also know is that voters have become much more party loyalists. They are intensely partisan. So the ground effect of redistricting is playing out in a very polarized and divided dynamic, which again only goes back to the saying, redistricting is the most political activity in American politics. And we're seeing it play out across the country.
So, Lee Drutman, because of politics, because of gerrymandering and redistricting, because of our primary system that tends to favor the most extreme candidates from both parties, a whole swath of voters smack dab in the middle are left out. And that has given rise to this feeling that maybe we need a third or more political party. And Dr. Bitzer and I have spoken on this program many times about why that won't work given our two-party system in this country. But your book, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, is a place where you make the case that two-party rule pushes us toward extreme polarization and conflict, and that it's been that way almost since the beginning. But in the post-World War II era, it's my recollection at least, that these two parties got along to the point where a lot of voters said there's not a dime's worth of difference between these two political parties. So what's happened in the last several years to make them so diametrically opposite?
Well, what's happened is we've talked about a bit of what's happened, that we've had this geographical sorting of the parties in which the Republicans have become much more dominated by rural conservative parts of the country. Democrats have become much more centered on urban liberal parts of the country. And as Dr. Bitzer just mentioned, we've lost the Northeastern liberal Republicans and the conservative Southern and rural Democrats. Now, for a while, it's true, we've had two parties for most of our political history, although there's been some shifts in the earlier parts of our history. But basically, those parties were very broad national coalitions of state and local parties that were actually quite diverse. And so, to your point about dime's worth of difference, it wasn't that long ago in which the parties really didn't stand for all that much distinct at the national level. And what's really happened really over the last 3 decades has been this tremendous nationalization of our politics, this elevation of culture war politics, and this really zero-sum, all or nothing transformation of our politics. And it's not something that we can easily reverse within the two-party system. And so there are a lot of voters who feel that neither party represents them. Certainly a lot of voters who feel incredibly frustrated by all of this partisan fighting, all of this gamesmanship, all of this just, what seems to a lot of folks like just, mean-spirited pettiness when there are some real problems in this country. And I think the only way out of this is to break apart the two-party system and have, ideally, I think 5 or 6 parties that would then be able to form coalitions in different ways. Just like,
don't you have to have a parliamentary form of a legislature to make that happen and make it work successfully?
No. So this is I think something that a lot of folks are somewhat confused about. So there's proportional versus majoritarian systems, which you have a single member district tends to just generate two parties because the third parties become spoilers, wasted votes. So if you have a proportional voting system, like I said, if you had one statewide district for North Carolina or broke into 2 7-member districts, you could have a proportional system of voting. And if you have a proportional system of voting, it's possible for more than 2 parties to compete. Now, we often think that proportional systems are parliamentary systems because most of the proportional systems that we think of in European politics, like Germany or the Netherlands or Denmark, are parliamentary systems in which the legislature and the head of state, prime minister, are connected. However, the British system is a parliamentary system that is a majoritarian single-member system, so you can have that. You can also have presidential systems with proportional voting, but presidential systems don't have to be 2-party systems. It just happens that ours is. But it's important to understand that presidential versus parliamentary is a distinction, and proportional versus majoritarian or single winner is a distinction. And you can have those. You can have four potential combinations with those 2 variables.
So let's bring this home to the decision that we are anticipating sometime today, Steve. This 3-judge panel that will decide on whether the maps as redrawn by the legislature will stand and comply with the High Court's order for them to redraw and be fairer about how they drew them and to show their work. Given the lower court who will make this decision and their previous decision about this, which was to let the original map stand, do these judges have a horse in the race, or are they bound to use the rules set down by the High Court in making their decision about whether the new maps or the old maps will stand?
I was reading the filings that both parties made, because Mike, you talked about they have to show their work. There are these analysis that the maps have to go through, these efficiency gap, how many wasted votes do you have, that kind of thing. And the expert for one group says our map passes with flying colors, and the hired expert from the other side says that no, they do not. It is. I think everyone can agree that the maps are more balanced. I don't think that's in dispute, that they are more competitive maps. But then when you read the dueling reports from the witnesses, they make the maps out to be just completely different. I mean, Mars and Venus.
So if the lower court today decides that the legislature was successful in following the higher court's order and that these maps are okay, does that end all of this? Is the chapter closed?
Yes, I believe so. No, Michael, you're shaking your head. I mean,
I would say if the legislative maps, the remedial maps prevail, you may see an appeal to the state Supreme Court to ask for a stay. And if that happens, there could be a triggering effect of an appeal up to the US Supreme Court. So we'll get one decision, but by 5 o'clock, we may have another decision, and we could have another decision after that when candidate filing starts tomorrow.
Because candidate, that's really,
that's, I think, the other key thing.
That's the big thing is, right, we're supposed to open up filing tomorrow. And so any kind of right? Any kind of appeal would have to be settled, not settled,
Quickly.
but acted on quickly. Yeah.
And of course,
Ridiculous. It's a ridiculous
yes.
way to run a democracy.
One of the possibilities, Michael, is that the court could decide that these maps are not in compliance with what the high court ordered. In that case, what happens?
Then they could draw their own maps. I mean, if
Well,
they don't like all three maps, they could set them aside.
Well, let
Special
me ask you this,
masters.
because obviously, if they're going to hand down a decision sometime today, that decision has been made, and maybe it was made Friday afternoon at 7, because the deadline was Friday afternoon at 5
Correct.
for the legislature to submit these. So, if they had decided at some time over the weekend that these maps aren't adequate, could they have already gone to their special masters, had them redraw them, had the court approve them, and then when they announce their decision this afternoon or sometime today, they will also announce, having rejected the maps, this is what we're going to do? Or will we have to wait longer?
We are in pure hypothetical land, but yes, everything that you just said could be happening. The maps could have been redrawn by the special masters, reapproved by the judges, and we're just waiting that decision. We have no idea what's going to happen in a little over 2 hours from now.
So, Steve, these new congressional maps feature 6 safe Republican districts and 3 safe Democratic seats, leaving 5 other districts as potentially competitive. Here's the bottom line question, I guess, as drawn. Are these maps fair, or are they likely the best maps we will get from a legislature dominated by Republicans?
They are certainly much more fair and much more competitive than what we had 2 months ago. I think, and I think there's actually, I would characterize the map as having 3 really safe Democratic seats and 1 that is a lean Democratic seat. So maybe it's a 6-4-4. I think Democrats, one thing that really bothers them about the map is that the triad, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, is split up. They want a safe seat that pairs Greensboro with most of Winston-Salem. That would be an overwhelmingly Democratic seat that Kathy Manning would win easily. That seat doesn't exist. And instead, that seat is one of these 50-50 seats. Kathy Manning can win it, she can lose it, and they want a 6-5-3 map. I think there's a lot of other little smaller quibbles they have, but that's the big one, is that they want a 5th safe seat, and instead it's a toss-up. So I think that's what a lot of this is about.
And again, Michael, we've been talking a lot about these congressional maps, but in truth, all politics are local. And although congressional races determine your local representative to Congress, what determines that are how these maps are drawn. And that's all done in the legislature. These maps, as submitted, will they result in a legislature that is more representative of the 2 political parties as the voters seem to be than the current legislature? In other words, will we end up with fairer maps in the future because it won't be so dominantly Republican because of gerrymandering, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, I think the legislative maps on the whole, in comparison to the previous maps that were struck down, are more, as Steve would say, balanced. I think that there are more opportunities for Democrats to pick up seats in these maps. There are more competitive seats across the board. The question I have going forward, and you're already hearing real hints by some Republican operatives, is come November, Republicans retain control of the legislature. Let's say that happens. They also win one of the 2 state Supreme Court Senate seats. That then flips the majority from 4-3 Democratic to 4-3 Republican. We then get a challenge to the congressional maps. It goes back up to the state Supreme Court. They strike this now balanced congressional map down. They can't do anything with the legislative maps. And then we go through this cycle again. And next year, Republicans come back to redraw a much more Republican-leaning map. I think the hints are already there by a number of Republican operatives to say, be careful what you wish for, because elections matter and elections have consequences. And we could come back to revisit this next year and really impose a draconian Republican map.
And we don't have a lot of time left, only a couple minutes left in this program. But here's something we haven't talked about yet, and that is whether or not a legislature elected under a gerrymandered map is legitimate. And the state NAACP is challenging two recent amendments to the Constitution, the Voter ID Amendment and the state income tax not being able to be above 7% law that's been passed by the Republican legislature. They say that Republican-led legislature gave themselves an inordinate amount of power. This case is, I think, a first-of-its-kind lawsuit, Lee Drutman. Why haven't similar suits been filed elsewhere if there's examples of egregious gerrymandering going on around the country?
Well, I expect we will see more of these suits. I mean, we are in this incredible, what I call a doom loop. You can think of it as an arms race in which fighting for these narrow district boundaries is, I mean, it's truly a blood sport in our politics. It's the nastiest, ugliest thing because it determines who has power. So, I mean, what kind of way is this to run a democracy in which, you know, we're following this labyrinthine path of courts and legislatures, and then they're going to redo the boundaries, and then there's going to be more lawsuits. I mean, it's so much simpler, straightforward, fairer to just have a system of proportional representation in which your share of votes in the state equals your share of seats in the legislature.
But you yourself are not very optimistic about that ever happening. In fact, you say that the only way we get to major structural reform is for the Republicans to win unified government in 2025 and then just overreach incredibly. I have 30 seconds, not even that. I have 10 seconds. If that happens, some pundits are saying we'll become an authoritarian state. The votes won't matter. What about that? Very quickly, 10 seconds.
Well, I think it will provoke a tremendous backlash, and it's in these moments of tremendous backlash that we get real structural change.
Lee Drutman is senior fellow at the New American think tank. Steve Harrison is our political reporter here at WFAE News, and Dr. Michael Bitzer is professor of politics and history at Catawba College. Thank you all for the hour.
Charlotte Talks with Mike Collins is a production of 90.7 WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from Mazda of South Charlotte. Our executive producer is Wendy Herkey. The senior producer is Aaron Keever. Our producers are Gabe Altieri and Jesse Steinmetz. Our engineer is Joby Sprinkle. For more information about Charlotte Talks, go to wfae.org/Charlotte Talks.
Black Profiles presented by listener-funded public radio 90.7 WFAE. If you've taken the Moderna vaccine, you have Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett to thank for that. 36-year-old Dr. Corbett hails from Hurdle Mills, North Carolina, and is the scientific lead for the coronavirus vaccine team at the National Institutes of Health in the vaccine